Greetings, viewers. This is the True Patriot podcast. We meet again at 6 p.m. this Wednesday, like we always do. Today, we deal with a very important issue with regards to the coming 2028 elections. Now, we have had numerous conversations where some citizens are saying there's no need to participate in elections that are already rigged. And they're saying there should be reforms before the elections are conducted. But some insist that elections are the only way to transform Zimbabwe towards a democracy, and boycotting elections will only entrench the dictatorship. So there are really different schools of thought, which all helps to shape our democracy. As the True Patriot podcast, we are here to hear arguments from both sides of the narrative. And to help me in this particular conversation, I've invited Tony Rila, who is a part to a group of citizens of Zimbabwe who are demanding a national transition authority as a precursor to holding elections. But we have also invited the General Secretary of the Zimbabwe Communist Party, Comrade Naruto Mabena, who insisted that the elections should go ahead and citizens should ensure that they participate in the process in a way that shapes the outcome. Tony, can you meet our viewers?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. Comrade Mabena, greet our viewers.
Greetings to you, Comrade President, and to my colleague, Comrade Rila, and to everyone who is following this discussion.
Okay, thank you so much, both of you, for agreeing to be part of this particular conversation. Let's begin with you, Tony. We understand your position that you don't want elections before any reforms. Can you argue more so that we get to understand the premise of such an argument?
Thank you. Let's be clear. I'm not against elections. I'm against electoral contests that are unfair and rigged. So the question is, where do we stand with elections? Well, my argument would be that virtually every single election since 2000 has failed to meet the test of a decent election. In fact, the last one got a failing grade from the SADC Election Observer Mission, never mind everyone else. So they clearly said that this election did not meet the conditions. Now, it is not merely a question of an election that matters here. It's the entire playing field that has to exist. And I think most people would agree with me that at the moment the country is in dire problems. The citizens are deeply impoverished. Government is not functioning. Public services and goods and services are not being delivered. And above all, apart from the opposition being in tatters, every sign is that the major political party, is in major conflict itself. Now, these are not good conditions for the going to an election. So the argument we would make, and we've been making this, some of us on the Platform for Concerned Citizens from 2016, is that it is impossible for Zimbabwe to hold an election that passes the test of legitimacy and legality without major reforms. And that means no interference by the executive in the electoral process, Parliament doing its oversight role properly, and courts that will adjudicate on any matters in a non-partisan, free and fair way. Now, none of these conditions are here at present, and it is very doubtful that they will take place before 2028. So what will happen in 2028 is a prediction that many of us make, is that we will hold another election that fails the test of legitimacy in the international community and from the citizens itself. And therefore, we will then have wasted another 3 years preparing for this election, probably in the absence of any major reforms. And I don't mean minor reforms to the Electoral Act or the regulations of elections, we mean major reforms of the state. And so what we will do is we're really going to postpone the inevitable problem until 2028, and then we will start all over again. So that's the position. No reforms, no election, in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. There you have it, Comrade Mabena. Tony says another election, the outcome will be a contested outcome in the wasted 2028. Now we have gone through election cycles since 2000 that have already always been disputed. We want to hear from you, Comrade Mabena, why you think participating in the 2028 election without reforms will assist Zimbabwe.
Thank you so much once again. Our position is very clear that indeed we agree with Comrade Rila. We differ at the end, and I will explain. We agree that elections must be held under the SADC guidelines of holding free and fair elections. So electoral reforms must be implemented. The SADC Observer Mission in the last election in 2023 identified areas that need to be implemented before holding a new election in Zimbabwe. And as a party, we are pushing for that to happen. But what we are saying as the Zimbabwe Communist Party is that we understand our terrain where we operate in Zimbabwe, in that one, public representation to many political parties and individuals, it has become a source of income, be it your National Assembly or your council. So if you are going to declare that you are going to not to participate in an election, other opposition parties will participate. They will be formed. Individuals will contest as independent candidates, because there are constituencies in Zimbabwe where even if electoral reforms are not implemented, the opposition is known that it is going to win. From 2000, it has been difficult for ZANU-PF to win in urban constituents. So if we do not participate in the election, we are giving ZANU-PF a free ride in what one will term the opposition stronghold. They will control all the councils in cities, in towns. They will have their MPs in the working class communities, which in the past they did not have. So this is why it is critical that even if the electoral reforms which we demand are not implemented, we must participate to protect the gains of the working class that were achieved since 2000 without surrendering that to ZANU-PF. And the other point that we must also make is that the state as it is constituted today represents the interest of the class that it serves. That is the looting class. So the parliament, the courts, the electoral board, they all represent they are all state apparatus, and we do not think that on their own they are going to reform. So we need to use council chambers. We need to use the National Assembly as a theater for struggle. The problem is that the opposition that is represented in parliament is fragmented. So with the sense that we have gained over the years, we should have used the parliament as a theater of struggle. We should have used the councils as a theater of struggle to fight for these reforms that we need, because what we seem not to be winning, it is the presidency in Zimbabwe which is king. Of course, we know that elections are always rigged. If you recall, in 2008, it was only ZANU-PF for the first time lost its majority in the last elections, 2018 and 2023. they got a two-thirds majority. But Mnangagwa struggled to get 50 plus 1% of the vote. And we hold the firm view that Nelson Chamisa in 2018 won the elections, but of course was not declared the winner. So this is why I was saying we should not open up or surrender the space that we have won. We must continue to forge ahead with the strategy. So in conclusion, if we had only one party that is in the opposition, where you don't have career parliamentarians, we would by now be achieving these reforms, at the very least, the SADC guidelines on holding free and fair elections. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. Now, both of you spoke of electoral reforms in passing. I want to hold both of you to it. What would be the minimum threshold that you think should of reform that make sure our elections can be considered to be legitimate, to be credible within the Zimbabwe context? Maybe we can begin with you, Tony. The minimum threshold that you can speak of. Then Comrade Mabeno can also come on. Both of you seem to be agreeing on the need of reforms.
Thanks, Ovid. I mean, I'm coming from a deeply skeptical position, first and foremost, that we will get anything like minimum reforms. If you recall, ahead of the last election, ZESN and the election observer groups here within Zimbabwe identified somewhere in the region of 114 required reforms, right? And they commented when the elections actually took place that less than 10% had been agreed to by the government. So that's a serious issue. The question is, when you pose the reforms and what the minimum reforms are, will you get the minimum reforms? So first and foremost, you have to have absolute participation by citizens. And that means access to information, freedom of association, all of the things that currently are under threat. And those are not guaranteed at all. You have no access by any other voices than ZANU-PF on the state media. And so the citizens have no access to understanding the issues and being informed properly. So that would be an absolutely critical reform. And if you've done any research on it recently, you'll discover that Zimbabwe in the region is probably the least free when it comes to those basic freedoms, whether it's academic freedom, whether it's press freedom, whether it's citizen freedom. So some serious stuff has got to be done there. That requires a stand back from the state to agree to full participation by citizens. Now, if we take Comrade Mabeno's point about the rigged elections, I think another way you can put this is it's doubtful that ZANU-PF has actually won a single election since 2000. 2008 was clear, and SADC basically ducked the bullet there. What they didn't do is insist on a change of government. So those are critical reforms. Another reform that is absolutely critical ahead of this election is the military have to be returned to the barracks. Since 2017 and the Chiweshi judgment, it is clear that his judgment essentially made a constitutional amendment which argued that Section 212 gives the military the constitutional right to intervene in civilian affairs. Now, this is nonsense. No country in the region does not have the military under full civilian control. So a prerequisite for these elections is that judgment has to be overturned and the military have to firmly be put under civilian control. That's absolute minimum. Without that, we don't have a game. So you've got freedoms, return of the military. Thirdly, there's the question of the clientelism and the vote buying that goes on. I mean, every Zimbabwean is watching at the moment now the most egregious clientelism of jobs, of money, of cars, of all the ways in which the ruling party is attempting to subvert the constitutional process. So they're trying to buy the country, essentially. That's what's going on. I don't think they can, but that's what they're trying to do. Now, that's unacceptable behavior in an election, right? In electoral terms, that's called cheating. There shall be no cheating, okay? And all constituencies involved in elections, from right out in the rural areas, traditional leaders, the civil servants, district administrators, etc., all of those are supposed to be non-partisan bodies. So you want to see between now and an election, if we ever have one, that's clear demonstration that all of those agencies are operating in a non-partisan way. So there are no reports, like the Zimbabwe Peace Project points out again and again, of villagers being denied access to food or farm inputs, these things being done on a partisan basis. There must be clear evidence of all of those conditions. Now, if you meet those minimal conditions, you can begin to think that there's a possibility of a decent election. But you also have to ensure an even more important criteria, and that is that when the SADC election observer mission comes and it passes a failing grade, there are consequences. Okay? It is insufficient to say this election did not meet the SADC principles and guidelines on holding democratic elections. If you fail, there must be consequences. So you don't have a summit which congratulates Zimbabwe on having a peaceful election, and you don't have a SADC summit saying we congratulate Mozambique on having a peaceful election, when the Mozambican elections were anything but peaceful and 200 plus people died and the whole country was in a riot because the elections were quite patently rigged in front of everybody's eyes. So the minimum conditions, if you begin to think about it in the way that I'm putting them, basically amount to a massive reform process that needs to take place. And it needs to be taking place now and not minor tinkering with the Electoral Act. So, you know, what in essence I'm saying is I don't believe that the government will meet anything like these minimal reforms. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Tony. Comrade Babena, do you have anything to add with regards to the minimum threshold of reforms?
Indeed. Thanks once again. We need a credible electoral body that will manage elections. We do not need an electoral body that is staffed with the ZANU-PF members. If we're having a progressive parliament, we will push for the parliament to approve the names of members of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. They should not just be appointed by the ruling party. The whole electoral management system must be transparent, must be free and fair, transparent. The voter registration must be done transparent. Everyone who's eligible to participate in the electoral process must indeed be allowed to register and participate in the elections. This also brings the question of the diaspora vote. Professor Mthuli, the Minister of Finance, always mentions the remittances which runs into millions from the diaspora, but the diaspora community does not have the right to participate in an election. So for a free and fair election to happen, the diaspora vote is critical. The campaigning itself by political parties, by candidates, must be free and fair. That also brings into question the role of the Zimbabwe Republic Police and the other security agencies who, in the most of cases, refuse opposition parties and candidates to hold public meetings. In all elections, food is used as a political tool, and the other freebies like farming inputs, which are distributed. These are bought by state using state money, but distributed from the ZANU-PF headquarters to their provincial and districts. This should not be happening. SADC Observer team was very clear on the question of media that the role of the public media is to report accurately. So opposition members, opposition candidates or political parties should have a space in the public media. And the last, of course, the electoral fees for candidates in the last elections, particularly the presidential, they were too high. Also parliamentary, they were too high. So there must be a reduction in fees for candidates. And of course, Comrade has already spoken about traditional leaders who see themselves not as a neutral, they see themselves as civil servants. And of course, civil servants, being a civil servant does not mean you are a member of a political party. We must make a distinction between the government of Zimbabwe and the ZANU-PF as a political party. So if you are a civil servant, it does not mean you belong to ZANU-PF. So you must be patriotic as you are a patriot, Comrade President. Being patriotic means you can support your government, but differ with the ruling party. Thank you so much. In fact, support your country, but differ with your government and the ruling party. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. But let me hold you still there, Comrade Mabena. Now, if these minimum reforms, we don't get them, and we are getting into the election in 2028, as opposition, or maybe advice to other opposition parties, what should the opposition do under such circumstances to ensure that they have a strong performance, given that it is the conflation of the state and the party and everything, all these pitfalls that you've already spoken to? What has to be done before, during, and after the process to at least guarantee that the opposition can have a strong performance, given all the pitfalls that we already know?
I think, like I've already said before, that with or no reforms, it is given that the opposition does win in urban centers. We can go back to the elections in 1985, where ZAP won in Matabeleland under Kukrahundi. We know of the violence from 2000, but the opposition has always been winning in urban centers. But what is key, which has been missing in the last elections, is that the opposition will seem to cover all polling stations in terms of election agents without covering or monitoring or sending polling agents to polling stations in the farming communities and in rural communities. I've participated as an NP candidate. I know that in the farming communities, people are being intimidated. So local people would not want to expose themselves to stand as a polling agents in their own locality because of the intimidation. So it's critical in our view that we invest and bring people that are not necessarily resident in that local community who become polling agents, so that they cannot bow down to any threats. Because people will be told that if they are seen in a polling station on behalf of the opposition, their homes are going to be burned. So they will burn 2-3 homes in a village to send a clear message to anyone who would want to be stationed on behalf of the opposition in a polling station. So these are some of the things that we must do. But above all, we must consolidate in the working class communities. We should not give way to ZANU-PF to enter what we deem to be the opposition stronghold. And then we develop systems on how do we win the rural vote, because what is critical is that the ruling party has been winning the rural vote through rigging, and the other thing outside the rigging is that they would identify a candidate who lives in that area, while in the opposition will provide a candidate who becomes a tourist candidate, identify a candidate to go and stand in Mrewa, but the candidate is based in Harare. So these are some of the things that you should look into. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, Tony, some critics will say, when you are asking for these perfect electoral reforms or the good electoral reforms, it can be viewed as a stalling tactic that actually benefit the incumbent, which will remain in power at the end of the day indefinitely. The incumbent remains in power indefinitely whilst you are waiting for these reforms. And on the other hand, it is the citizen who is disenfranchised. It is the opposition that is weakened whilst we want on waiting for the perfect reforms. What would be your view? What would be your response to that? Hello, Tony. We can't hear you. You are on mute. Yeah?
Sorry, I was muted. Sorry. Okay. One of the primary purposes of an election is to give citizens voice, to give citizens power to choose a political party that will implement the kind of governance, public goods and services that they want. Okay. And that's very important. So we often talk very theoretically, with apologies to Comrade Mabena, about all these things that might happen. But the reality is that Zimbabweans vote. They pretty much vote in desperation because they have no political trust. Over 30 years of experience has taught them to have no trust in the state, the kinds of agents that Comrade Mabena is talking about, local government officials, civil servants, etc., etc. They have no trust in the government. They have no trust in political parties. They have very little trust in the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. So they vote, and in between times, they are largely inactive. They don't go to community meetings. They don't join protests. People are too keen to call them apathetic, and they call them apathetic because they're fearful of retribution, which is not a trivial idea, but they also have given up. And so elections offer an opportunity to say something, but to say something in little hope that anything will change. So the demonstrations for the citizens to participate fully, to be willing to be a polling agent, to be a candidate in the House of Assembly or in local government, must be that in the years prior to an election, it is quite clear that what everybody else in the region would call normal democratic life is present. That means the police are demonstrably non-partisan, that civil servants are not indulging in the kinds of activities that Comrade Mabena described. So all of those conditions are critical to this full participation, right? That you will see an opposition candidate like Comrade Mabena being interviewed on national television and national radio and not on streaming services, explaining to the nation as a whole what the policies of the Communist Party are. Now, those give people confidence in elections. And that's the critical thing. So you have to go back to the citizens, first and foremost, and ask yourself, what do the citizens actually want? Not the techies who understand all these things. What do they see as normal socio-political life? And are they actually free to participate in the ways that they think they are able to? When those conditions are present, you will see citizens engaging elections in a much greater way. For example, if you look at the Afrobarometer data, what do citizens do when it comes to elections? They go to a rally in small numbers, but they most certainly don't work for a political party or go to or work for a candidate, etc., etc. They're not absent in the process. Now, that speaks to the deep lack of political trust that the citizen has. So you want to change that? I think you're still stuck with a very serious reform problem. Thank you.
While you are still there, Tony, now assuming that, as we all know, government is not willing, this ZANU-PF is not willing to implement these reforms, what practical steps can be taken to compel them to institute the reforms, and how realistic are those tactics given our Zimbabwean context? Because we have discussed the possible reforms that we want, but how do we compel ZANU-PF to implement those reforms?
Okay. Well, let's put aside the notion of massive advocacy nationally for a national transitional authority for the time being. As you know, I'm a devotee of that Adai. Elections also do a very important thing. They confer legitimacy. So when you confer legitimacy, it means that a political party wins by a majority and that the majority of citizens have participated in the election. Now, some of us are old enough to remember a famous presidential election in the 80s where Robert Mugabe won with 14% of the vote after Ndabaningi Sithole and Abel Muzorewa withdrew. Quite clearly, 14% of the electorate voting Robert Mugabe in was a huge damaging factor in the legitimacy of the presidency. Okay, so there's always this problem. If the reforms aren't there, do you say vote or no vote? That's the question that it comes down to, and people hesitate to do that. And I heard what Comrade Mabena said. If you don't vote, you hand the government to them on a plate. Now, we've never tried that option of not voting, of boycotting. And we continually vote. And as all of us know, apart from 2008, there has never been an overturn of the political party. Zambia's had multiple, Seychelles, even Madagascar has had changes. We've just had one in Botswana. When citizens are thoroughly fed up with their governments generally fall. It's never happened in Zimbabwe for the obvious reasons. So the choice is you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You're damned if you vote in a rigged election and possibly you're damned if you boycott it. But the point about the boycott is if a massive number of people do not vote, it's only a minority of the voters who vote, that taints the legitimacy of the government considerably. Now, I don't really have a clear answer. Boycotts are always complicated, and sometimes by insisting on a boycott, you do hand it to them on a plate. But as I say, the conditions ahead of the election need to be articulated very clearly and not just minimally about changing ZEC. As I said before, on all of these conditions need to be present and absolutely clear to every citizen that they are able to participate in a free electoral process. Then I think you've got grounds for saying, no, you do vote. But if none of those conditions are there, what do you say to people? I'm not sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let me bring in Comrade Mabena. Now, Comrade Mabena, some critics would then say, if you go and participate in an election you already know is rigged, you are handing over the legitimacy to the ruling party, like what Tron is saying. But now you already know that you are going to be rigged. The outcome is known. Getting parliamentary seats, obviously, we know that we have a constitution that gives so much power to the presidency and the executive, and at the end of the day, there are no meaningful reforms. So what we are doing one election after the other is just to simply go and give them legitimacy. What would you say about that?
You might actually prevent ZANU-PF from getting 2/3 majority in the National Assembly if you participate in an election, which means that the parliamentary agenda and to an extent even the passing of the budget will require a dialogue between ZANU-PF and the parties that are represented in parliament. But if you give them a free rein, they attain 2/3 majority, they win the presidency. They have no problem with the question of legitimacy because in 2018, we said Mnangagwa was not a legitimate president. We said so in 2023. But we see them continuously looting our resources. We have seen the emergence of the looting class since Emmerson Mnangagwa, who is, in our view, illegitimate, taking center stage, the Zwigambas that you have today, the rolling out of motor vehicles if as Atus you also ask for a vehicle and you tell them that to not demonstrate against them, they will certainly give you vehicles. So there's no penalty for them to be said that they are illegitimate. They've been applying, of course, with the difficulty to rejoin the Commonwealth. They have not been accepted. But with the coming in of Trump in the United States, the cutting of funding to civil society, not only in Zimbabwe, but globally, has meant that pressure cannot be exerted by the international community to force the ZANU-PF to reform. And within the SADC region itself, there's shift in the balance of forces. We saw what happened to the elections in Malawi. Chakawera, who was seen possible as a not from, even though his party is that of Banda, but a person who was born towards the Malawi independence, whom you will think is progressive. You saw how they treated him. So you have these challenges. So in our view, indeed, you need reforms in Zimbabwe. This T-shirt that I'm wearing, it is written 2023. We were supposed to launch our program in 2023 in Kwekwe. We traveled to Kwekwe, but were denied to hold a public meeting. We are supposed to launch a Red October in Bulawayo in November. We were discussing with Comrade over the weekend that there's a big chance that we might be denied the right to hold a public meeting, because we are dealing with a regime that is on panic mode, a regime that knows that the unit of the working class and the peasantry will drive it out of power. So if we then not participate, we saw what happened to Triple C. Because if when the recalls happened in Triple C and everyone withdrew from parliament, indeed it was going to render that parliament illegitimate. So our fear is that you have opposition parties, you have others who are independent, whose livelihood is dependent on parliament and on council. When you then refuse to participate in an election, they will certainly feel that vacuum, because nature by itself does not allow a vacuum. So what we must do, we must demand reforms, but at the same time, we must not disarm citizens to say that if we participate in a rigged elections, indeed, or in an elections where the reforms are not implemented, the entire election is going to be rigged. We disarm them. So we need to develop a strategy of balancing the two, of on one hand demanding the reforms, that the reforms indeed must happen as we outlined them, but equally that every Zimbabwean who's eligible to vote must participate in the electoral process, including those in the diaspora. People must volunteer to be deployed in polling stations, so that we make it difficult at a polling station for them to rig election. Then we can deal with the question of past, as it was in the last election. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that. Tony, let me bring this to you. Beyond the legitimacy issue, what are other tangible risks that you foresee that are likely to happen if these elections go on to be held without prior reforms? Of course, we have talked to the issue of legitimacy, but what are the other risks that are associated with another electoral process without reforms? You are still on mute, Tony.
I don't think you can talk about risks for an election without talking about risks for the country. Okay? I think it's very clear that Zimbabwe is in a very high risk state. Okay? It's rated one of the most fragile countries in the world, and this is in a country that's not even at war. Okay? It fails on every criteria of governance: corruption, good governance, press freedom. It gives a picture of a totally undemocratic and failing state. Now, it is within that context you have to assess the risks for election. And in that context, you have to assess the risks for a ruling party to undertake those reforms. And the major risk is that the accountability issue for the ruling party of its appalling human rights record, its massive, massive, massive corruption off the scale in the last years, is that state, that government cannot afford to lose an election and be out of power because of the accountability issues. So, I mean, I agree with everything that Comrade Mabena is saying. We have to demand the reforms, we have to get citizens involved, we have to do all of those things. But I also fear that what that leads to, without a major political change in this country, is an exercise in futility. Okay? And so Zimbabweans, the biggest risk I see coming in this is that once again, well, I don't know how many times, apart from 2008, Zimbabweans will go to the polls, they will vote, and they will see their votes turn to nothing. And that is a very damaging consequence for the country going forward. So you can't assess the risks before, you have to assess only before. It's before, during, and after that you have to assess the risk and what it's going to do to the country. So the major risk that I see now, and one of the reasons why the Platform for Concerned Citizens was formed and why we pushed for a national transitional authority, was the fear of a militarized state. And that, in fact, took place in 2017. It remains there, okay? So the biggest risk factor that I see is that we do not assert civilian control over the military and demonstrable civilian control over the rights and freedoms that they have to participate in social and political life. It's outrageous that the Communist Party can go to hold a meeting and be denied by the police for holding a meeting. Every citizen should be able to hold any meeting they want. When they're stopped, whether they're in the urban areas or whether in the rural areas, that is a demonstration, a hard indicator that the playing ground is being rigged. So the risks are largely political, causing very serious problems economically, and being run by a military state. That's the political risk in the election that has to be addressed. If we take the issue of demanding reforms, let's look at what actually does happen. We get no reforms way ahead of an election. We get them at the 11th hour. Roughly 9 months before an election, you'll see some minimal reforms. So unless the reforms that Comrade Mabena is talking about happen now, begin right now, 2025, we've got 3 years to ensure that the state media is absolutely non-partisan, that the police are not partisan, that political parties or any candidate is holding meetings. If those conditions are not there, then you do not have the reforms that you need, because they're broader than that. And, obviously, as Comrade Mabena pointed out, a total rework of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission.
Okay, Comrade Mabena, I want to turn around the same question that I gave Tony. What tangible risks do you foresee if the elections are delayed while still are pushing for reforms? What is the risk associated with that, to delay holding elections while people are fighting for reforms? What are some of the political risks that? But you also feel free to jump into what you might have left out from your own perspective.
It fits, unfortunately, it fits into the 2030 agenda, because already there are attempts to push elections to 2030 in the name of 2030 agenda, which we thought was an economic vision, but which has now, the political question has been incorporated into this 2030 vision. So if we say elections should not happen, they should happen in 2030 or beyond, let's say beyond 2028, you might get those that are in the Mnangagwa camp who because they have their own agenda, which is different from us, who will begin to listen to us and pretend as if they are working with us and promise us that, yes, indeed, let us identify the issues that needs to be implemented, and these issues cannot be implemented by 2028. Let's move the elections beyond. And once we agree to that, we have already become part of their agenda. But the second point which I needed to throw in is this, is that the opposition from 2000 has seen as a puppet of the imperialist forces. So there's need also to throw away the puppetry jacket. Because it is critical in our view. Yes, the ZANU-PF under Mnangagwa is warming up to imperialist forces. It is not as what Mugabe's ZANU-PF was post the coup in 2017. But it's also critical that the opposition be pan-African, be Zimbabwean enough and pan-African, and not give ZANU-PF power to discredit the opposition in international fora. And of course, Comrade Tony Riela and yourselves, Comrade President, did participate in the Save Zimbabwe campaign. What made the Save Zimbabwe campaign to score some success, if one were to say this, it was because there was so much pressure from the Western world to President Mbeki and to others in the SADC region to force the ZANU-PF to reform. And you know, of course, that even in Britain, even at some point, thought of a military campaign against Zimbabwe. So to avoid a total control or a dominance by the Western forces, SADC was then pushed to a corner, which in somewhere in May 2007 convened that SADC summit, which began the dialogue amongst the Zimbabwean political actors facilitated by SADC. So this time around, balance of forces, as I've said earlier on, have changed, and we do not see any pressure that will come from the international community that will force the SADC region to pressure ZANU-PF. We saw what happened within, was it the deputy chairperson of the SADC observer team, or was the chairperson a Zambian colleague, what he was attempting to do and how that fell flat. And of course, Zimbabwe has been a military state since the 1980s. It has always been a deep militaristic state. Only that we did not see it in those years, other than Kukurahundi, which was there, but it came to the full gear in 2017. ZANU-PF itself cannot, which is our argument, it has never experienced democratic transition. As told in 1974 was forced by the ZANLA commanders. Mugabe was installed by ZANLA commanders, and in 2017 Mnangagwa was installed by the military. So inside the ZANU-PF itself, there's never been a democratic transition from one leader to the other. It is different from the other liberation movements, be it the ANC, SWAPO, Frelimo, Chama Mpunzi, and others. So to expect a party that has never undergone a democratic transition internally, to then expect that it will be willing to hand over power in the name of electoral reforms, I'm afraid I do not see this happening. And the whole question of the 23rd agenda, it's because 2027 Congress, Mnangagwa should be stepping down, but because they've never experienced this a democratic transition. This is why you now hear these funny things, the 23rd agenda and so forth. Lastly, in 2013, when I was an MP candidate, we only managed to buy the voters' roll 3 weeks before an election. And it made it difficult for us to do our political analysis to check who was on the voters' roll, who was not on the voters' roll, because, you know, in terms of our African tradition, you cannot call an old woman by their first names. So this is the crisis that we had. So the voters' roll must be made available in time so that opposition parties and the candidates can inspect the voters' roll, assist those that whose name would be missing in the voters' roll to register and participate in the electoral process. Thank you so much.
Now, Comrade Mabena, whilst you are stood there, you mentioned the Save Zimbabwe campaign and you said it only worked because there was international pressure. Are we saying locally it's impossible to apply pressure on ZANU-PF? We've seen in Madagascar right now, they've dissolved government because of serious massive protests of citizens demanding change. We have seen protests elsewhere in the world. Because now we are looking at the electoral process. After every election, we seem to see the movement itself, the opposition being fractured, people getting disillusioned, losing hope, and strengthening the idea of the invincibility of ZANU-PF. ZANU-PF comes out of every election declaring that they are invincible, they are unconquerable, the opposition is disillusioned. What would be your take on that?
Mass action in Zimbabwe is not our culture, even during the War for National Liberation. Unlike South Africa, where people will do in Soweto, will face the apartheid regime, the security forces. In Zimbabwe, we never did that. Our culture was always the Bush War. So in the absence of a mass action, you will not go through the military campaign, which we did during the colonial days, fighting for freedom. So that's the disadvantage that we have. You are a trade unionist yourself, Comrade President, and you know how the regime responds to anyone who takes to the streets. We saw what happened in 2019 when workers demanding better working conditions and better wages, how they were brutalized by the security forces in Zimbabwe. So I do not think, in my view, that the citizens or the working class and peasant in Zimbabwe can sustain a mass action which will force ZANU-PF to reform. I do not see this happening. What you call what is that? The Promise Mkwananzi movement says Jigiles. I can't remember the real name, which tried, and this flag of the pastor, all of them as well, and including, of course, the movement for democratic change, did not manage. Yes, the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions did in 1997, towards the end of 1997, when AIDS tax was imposed, and also the food riots that we saw. But we do not think that will sustain what we saw in North Africa and in other places, to an extent that ZANU-PF can be forced to a negotiating table. They will always unleash their security forces against the demonstrators. And possible the weakest point that we have is that when young people run out of employment, when the economic situation bites, we see it easy to jump Limpopo River and be in South Africa and in other countries. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. But I will not try to pressure you on that. But in 2019, fuel prices were actually reduced. That was the reason why people protested in January 2019. Fuel prices had shot, but they were forced to revise them through protest. But anyway, maybe it had nothing to do with power. So
yeah.
You respond to that on the next cycle. Now, Comrade Tony, how do you keep the citizens mobilized? How do you keep the citizens mobilized? So let's say you are saying you are not participating in elections. We want electoral reforms before you participate in elections. But with time, people get disillusioned and they get demobilized. How do we maintain the citizen agency? How do we keep the momentum of an active citizen?
Well, can we just take one step back and deal with this issue of transition? Some years ago, a colleague and I, looking at transitional justice, looked at the issue of transitions, about 60 of them that had taken place over about 50 years. 50% of those transitions were negotiated. 39%, nearly 40%, were instituted by the regime itself, because the regime had, in fact, run out of legitimacy or its ability to run things. Where the opposition forces were very strong, they were able sometimes to insist on negotiations. And negotiations frequently lead to transitions. Collapses of the state are less common, but things like citizen-led overthrows are extremely uncommon, and not just in Zimbabwe, across the world. Now, mobilizing is a very difficult issue. I think I can, in my lifetime, I can see three epochs in which mobilization took place on a mass scale. The first was what Comrade Mobena talked about, and that was the Liberation War. And the mobilization in that was quite clearly the rejection of the colonial regime, and it was organized around a positive vision. The vote, one man, one vote, and the things that flowed out from that, like land and a whole series of questions. The next one I can think about is the process in the late 90s of the National Constitutional Assembly. This was a positive goal for citizens. And as we all remember, it mobilized people to an extravagant extent. It led to the rejection of a referendum. It was an important factor in the formation of a very powerful opposition party. Now, since that time, and particularly perhaps since about 2008 or so, most of the campaigns for mobilizing are negative. And negative, in this negativity, I would include elections. If you ask people to mobilize for electoral reform, I suspect citizens will not believe you. They don't believe that the reforms will take place. So what is the vision? What is the positive vision that you can give people to say, I'm willing to follow this idea? And I don't necessarily mean mobilized to take the streets and et cetera, I mean that in it, they have a clear vision of where they want to go, and they support the moves towards that. And I would suggest, personally, and I believe this very strongly, the only positive vision I can see out there to offer citizens is a transformational process that reforms comprehensively the entire political nature of the country before you start talking about elections. Elections is a consequence of it, but the reform process is the goal. So I think there's an enormous difference between mobilizing against and mobilizing for. And this may sound a little flaky, but I suggest a good idea, a good theory, is as powerful as you possibly can. And it was very clear from the early 60s that the denial of the vote, the denial of people to determine their future, mobilized the Zimbabwean populace. They supported the struggle. And it wasn't just the war veterans who did that. Hundreds of thousands of citizens were participant in that struggle and made that such an important struggle that the Rhodesian state was forced to the table and forced to negotiate itself out. And bear in mind what came out of that was a negotiated settlement, Lancaster House, right? It wasn't a peace treaty like the Unity Accord or the Global Political Agreement. It was a thorough transition. And both parties, by the way, to that negotiation were rejecting of the colonial state to whom they handed over the power. The British government came in, they disbanded parliament, they suspended the Zimbabwean constitution, and we were ruled from Whitehall. It was not the interests of the nationalist movements to support Britain. It was certainly not the view of the Rhodesians to hand over to Britain, but they were forced politically to do that. Now, that is important. Bear in mind here that Comrade Mobena has raised the issue of the 2020-2030 agenda. This is so farcical it's not true. Any survey, including ones that the government has done itself, shows that 90% of people, whether they're urban or rural, are not in favor of a third term. So what they're attempting to do flies in the face of total resistance from the people. Similarly, people have no interest in one-party states or military states. Zimbabweans know what they want. They want a proper democracy. So you have to find these compelling, positive narratives for people to organize around. And that doesn't have to be, as I said, the overthrow of the state. That has to create the conditions in which the ruling party understands its legitimacy is so broken, it has no choice but to negotiate and seek political settlement. Thank you.
Okay, let's say we are going towards elections, Tony. There are no reforms. What will be your message to the international community? We have failed to have any electoral reforms. Elections are coming in 2028. What will be your message to the international community, be it SADC, AU, the EU, the UK, the US, our traditional parties that have participated in our electoral processes?
Well, you know, the world's a very different place in 2025 than it was 5 years ago. The international order is absolutely broken. Donald Trump has broken the international order so comprehensively it's not true. So appeals to the international community, just take two examples, Ukraine and Gaza, both places where the Palestinians and Ukrainians are appealing to the international community to take action have failed utterly and completely. So when we talk about the community that we have to appeal to, it's SADC. And frankly, I don't think SADC is at all useful. If SADC can come up with a fail mark for our election and then write it off in one sentence, okay? Thank Zimbabwe for holding peaceful elections, and did the same thing about Mozambique. There is not the political will in this region to act on elections. They should act on a coup, but you'll notice that in 2017, everybody happily accepted the notion that this was a military-assisted transition and not a coup, whereas I think any political scientist worth his salt would have said, you know, when the military intervenes in the state, that's a coup, finished and clear. So there was no reaction to that, and I think the tentative steps, as Walter Mazembe pointed out, by the Troika to come and intervene were brushed aside by the Zimbabwean government, and no action was taken. So you can go to the international community and you can show them that we have failed the standards set by Africa, the AU, and by SADC, but I don't expect any response. And the only time we have had a response was when the bloodshed in 2008 was so egregious that the AU could not turn a blind face. So I would not wish for a very violent election, but if it's a question of rigging and an illegitimate assumption of power, I don't believe the community will act. I think the reality is that Zimbabweans, we're on our own. That's a fact. You know, nobody's coming to help us, and if we hope they're going to come and help us, it'll be a pretty forlorn hope. So unless we build the constituency for the reforms that are necessary, and then we become willing to defend those in all sorts of peaceful and non-violent ways, and all the data shows, by the way, that when it comes to elections, Zimbabwe is the most violent country in the region, but that violence is state-sponsored. Citizens are not violent. We are massively not violent, and we choose the course always of peaceful engagement and genuine, normal social pressure. So that's what we've got to look to. But if you want to organize them, give citizens a positive vision.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tony, for that. Now, Comrade Mabena, I want to ask you the morning after, about the morning after the election. How do we package the message? We knew that the election was going to be disputed, but we have seen in the past that after the disputed election, there is a lot of noise coming from the opposition that participated in an election knowingly, predictably, that the election was going to be rigged. And all the noise about the election rigging and election manipulation, if at some time brought consequences again to the whole nation, where other countries are not happy with the outcome of our own election, and we participated knowing that the election's outcome would be bad. I want to hear from you what would be the message on the morning after the election to the world after the flawed process.
The message is that our liberation is not complete, because the main reason why we participate in our elections is that we want to complete our liberation as the people of Zimbabwe. It is not complete. Completing the liberation of Zimbabwe requires that we dismantle the Zwigananda, or the looting class, as we call them. So an election, it's a first step in assisting us to dismantle the looting class. So beyond an election, we then carry this agenda to the National Assembly and to council chambers to continue to use those as a theater of struggling to demand that we dismantle the looting class and Zwigananda. We should not be going around complaining that elections were rigged, because we know that, as you are saying, that elections are going to be rigged. But the victories that we have scored in terms of consolidating the constituencies in the working class, we need to have parliamentarians who are cadres, who understand the nature of the struggle, who are going to use parliament as a platform to fight, to continue with the struggle of completing the liberation of Zimbabwe. Of course, Comrade Tony speaks about a transformation agenda. The people of Zimbabwe want to see ZANU-PF gone. This is why one place together just put cameras in front of his face and they began to speak. And there was an unplanned stay away. When he had called for mass action, people stayed away. Why did people stay away? Because they thought that the military was involved. Hence, that successive stay away. And the National Constituent Assembly, we should not forget that it was a part of the strike of the working class who rejected the neoliberal agenda as adopted by ZANU-PF in 1991, the Economic Structural Adjustment Program, which the working class realized that part of waging the striking, you needed to rewrite the Zimbabwean constitution, hence the establishment of the National Constituent Assembly. When government came up with a parallel process, which they called the Government Constitutional Reform Program or Agenda, it was then that the workers realized that you needed a workers-backed mass political movement that was going to challenge politically ZANU-PF, hence the formation of the Movement for Democratic Change. Unfortunately, as we all know, the MTC was then hijacked and now is no longer there. Of course, 1980 ushered in a neoliberal agenda, which today was still trying to dismantle. So because of the global tariffs that Trump has imposed around the world, we must begin to ask, which international community are we now talking about? Which international community is going to listen to us? African Union itself is divided. You have other leaders in the African Union who are pro-West, who support Trump. We're seeing the president of Kenya, how he behaves, and the other leaders. But of course, there's progress that we're seeing in some parts of Africa, but there are reactionaries that are there. So I agree with the comrade that Zimbabwe, we are on our own. What we need is to build this unity amongst ourselves as the people of Zimbabwe, not give space to ZANU-PF, particularly in the constituencies and the wards that we have been winning since 2000, but replace those parliamentarians with the cadres that will continue to carry this agenda in parliament and in council chambers as we press on to force the ZANU-PF to reform. And a part of the reason why there are no reforms is that parliament itself is not willing. The opposition MPs, we have been asking opposition MPs to say, can we talk about the diaspora vote? They have no interest in that, because if you have people in the diaspora participating in the elections, it will be difficult for ZANU-PF to rig. And the diaspora vote might deliver the presidential victory to the opposition. Thank you, comrade.
Thanks, comrade. Now, as we close, I just want your final words, but the final tied to your final words is the question that what are the practical steps that Zimbabweans can collectively do between now and the 2028 elections to ensure that there is urgency, to ensure that at least we can force some semblance of reforms so that we have a credible election in 2028. What can we do together as a people? Then we can also put in your parting shots.
The first step, or the first thing that we must do, we must have a grassroots organization. It is missing. The opposition is in disarray. So when you do not have a grassroots organization that will mobilize around the issues that Comrade Tony is speaking to, we are not going to succeed. So even this transformational agenda, it needs a grassroots mass political movement. So we must close ranks as the opposition. We must close the ranks as civil society, as trade unions, and speak with one voice, place our demands clear on the table as a strong opposition that is rooted in the mass of our people. Even if they were not going to provide us with the necessary reforms that we need, but at the very least, we are going to score victories. But the challenge that we have is that we are too divided. So unity is key as we move towards 2028.
Thank you so much, Comrade Mabena. Comrade Tony, the same question. Where to between now and 2028 and your parting shots?
Well, I've laid out what I think. I think there's one critical thing that goes all the way back to the NCA process, and that Zimbabweans were generally in favor of a proportional representation system. We have a first past the post system. And many countries in the region and many countries across the world, one of the keys for protecting their democracy and reducing polarization is to go to proportional representation. If you look, for example, at countries where first past the post operates, the United Kingdom, here, many places, first past the post requires 50+1 right across the board. It always does for a presidency. But proportional representation is absolutely critical, because what it means is you break down the possibility of the kind of rigging that you can do so easily in proportion in first past the post. Proportional representation means you cast your vote for a party, not for an individual. That means people in Ngokwe and Tawa can vote anywhere. They're not going to a polling station to be intimidated by thugs. They can go to town and they can vote in town. Proportional representation means you can more easily incorporate the diaspora. So I think that's one critical reform we need to take place. It'll break the polarization. It has the possibility of spreading the number of political parties. The Communist Party, for example, might well win seats in that, depending on the amount of votes they get. The second thing I think is that we have to change the nature of the executive presidency. It's an important constitutional change that needs to take place. We need to do what the South Africans do, and that is the president emerges out of the party that has the majority in parliament, right? It's essentially like a presidential prime minister, if you want. That means that the presidency is accountable in the party and into parliament in a very important way. And we've seen what happens in South Africa, right? Firing of Thabo Mbeki, Jacob Zuma, etc. You can have accountability and oversight in that particular way. So if there were two critical reforms over and above everything else that I've said, those two reforms are critical ahead of 2028. And we have to start that now. If we do that, then we will see a massive change. And I will also add, and this is very important because the women's vote is critical. They're a majority in the country. If you have proportional representation and you go with Section 15 of the Constitution, 50% of all posts, all candidates, etc., must be women. And that way you will ensure genuine gender equality, because in proportional representation, the party will have to have 50% of its proposed candidates being female, and we will change the nature of the parliament. And I suspect the woman's voice will be a highly effective voice on policy and everything else. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tony. Thanks, Comrade Mabena, for coming through for this important conversation on the democratic future of our dear republic. The conversation will continue whether to demand reforms before the vote or to vote as a first step towards the reforms. It is an ongoing conversation. But what is very important for Zimbabwe is to continue to have conversations among ourselves to find the best way forward to force the incumbent government to institute the critical reforms that can give Zimbabweans a fighting chance to be the owners of their own republic. I thank you so much for coming through. Thanks to our viewers for viewing this particular. Don't forget to this particular podcast. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to share links with others.
Mai,